So Filipe, we've had lots of chats over the last year or so, and we have the same frustration. We'd like to see airports developed in a logical manner where airports and airlines are working together.
Indeed.
We know that has not always been the case, but there really is an opportunity for airports and airlines to find a way to work together, because we have problems. We have capacity issues, we have service issues. How do we tackle it?
Yeah, I guess we have to start by one, accepting it, and that we can do better. We have to do better. I think it's a necessity. It's not luxury. And then I guess we have to start to talk openly and put things on the table and accept that we have more opportunities on both sides of the table, and prioritize them and work to them. So, but I think it really starts with making the effort of starting to talk and starting to exchange. And then clearly stating what are the objectives, what are your limits, where do you accept to go, where don't you accept to go, and based on this prioritize and hopefully develop an agenda to work out together.
Somewhere along the way I picked up this expression, the appetite comes with eating, right? But it seems like if we identified one airport that we could all agree needs help, and if the airport industry and the airline industry could get together and say, okay, this is a test case, let's get together with that particular airport being a willing participant in the process, of course, and say, look, this airport is capacity constrained, it's got poor service levels, it needs strategic investment. Let's start this one out properly, where the airlines and the airports are actually working together in advance to sort out the solutions, cost the solutions, and figure out how to pay for it. Rather than, and I can say on my own personal level, I've been involved in projects where the airlines only found out what the program was and what they were going to be paying for it the day the concession started.
True.
Obviously, if I was in the receiving end of that news, I wouldn't be very happy either.
No.
So, do you think is there appetite within the industry to find a pilot project where we could exercise this idea and use it as a test case?
Yes, absolutely. We've seen a few steps in the right direction. So interesting. We've been working with a few airports in the Caribbean. One of them has been very open in terms of inviting us in, and the airlines, and discussing to the point where they presented their design, and we said, look, we criticize the design, and constructively, of course, saying we can improve this, we don't need that, it's too much, too big. So there was some, let me call it, right-sizing of the terminal. And we went to the next step, which I was also very pleased, because we sat down and we discussed financials. We discussed, okay, what's the implication on rates and charges. There was an analysis done on sensibility analysis on what costs could be assumed by the airlines, which costs would be paid for by the passengers. What was the evolution of the charges of the long time. We discussed debt ratios, how they need to comply with their own internal governance and policies, and we worked out a pretty nice solution. So I think the positive thing there, Curtis, is that we all left the meeting with the understanding of what was going to be built, what the impact would be, what the timeline was going to be, what the phasing of that would be, and also what the cost would be. And that, again, for the airlines is nice and necessary, because it gives predictability, allows you to plan forward, and we really establish a completely different level of relationship going forward.
And I guess the other tricky part is that not all airlines have the same interests. So the home-based carrier has a very different need and vested interest in the layout and the capacity of the airport, whereas the airlines, that this is just some outstation for them, they might even be willing to live with substandard service just because it's a lower cost operation. And I've had that speech before, like, honestly, this is a small site for us. We don't really care that the service level is bad. We just don't want to pay more. Whereas the home-based carrier has a much stronger need,
interest,
but they also pay much more. So how do you balance between those outstation airports or airlines that are coming in versus, obviously the home-based carrier has to have a lot more say on what goes on. But they can't be building it only for the home-based carrier.
No, and the product is defunct now, which was the New Mexico City airport, and that was exactly the discussion we had. I think it took some time for us to establish a good relationship with the airport managing group that was leading the construction and the discussion around that. But clearly the role that we as an association took on behalf of our members was exactly what you're saying, because you had four big carriers on the ground, completely different business model, completely different needs. And we were trying to broker a kind of a solution in terms of saying, this is what they need on the ground, those four, but then we have other 40 plus airlines that fly into it. Those are the different types of level of services that they need. And I think the trick was trying to find a kind of, let me call it the happy medium, where we help build a construction whereby we had to establish a certain level of service as a minimum, but allowed for some flexibility upwards. So we didn't want everybody to have the highest possible cost from the beginning, but accepting that some carriers, because of their business models, they would be willing to
differentiate the service level, but you have to differentiate the pricing as well.
True. Right. And this is what it came about. And I guess one of the very interesting solutions that we reached when we were discussing the design of the check-in hall, we made it very modular and very flexible, to the point that they had, I think, 8 islands, and virtually all the islands could be looking differently depending on who they would be serving. And that would be based on one design, one set of technology, one set of equipment. But the modularity that we happened to build in together with the airport managing group and the consultants allowed us to say, okay, you want to be a 5-star carrier, you have all the bells and whistles. You are a local carrier, you want to have a simple backdrop, very little touch points and stuff, it's also possible using the same backbone.
And that's part of the friction point too, because often some of these projects are monumental projects.
Indeed.
And monumental in the truest sense. They're meant to be a monument, but they're a beautiful piece of architecture, but they're not expandable, they're not scalable. It's not a nice big box that you can just expand. So, there's always the state interest in having a
landmark,
a monumental building, a landmark. To you guys just want a box to work in that works that you can expand and manage.
And that's the point. I mean, going back to Mexico, and again, the project is defunct, but one of the, let's say, challenges we always faced when we were discussing that, and very public discussion, is we said it looks very nice. It's, architecturally speaking, it's a very appealing design. But as you say, it's not expandable, so we wouldn't necessarily have to go into satellites. And the other point that truly no one at that stage could answer is what will be the cost of operating that. We had a pretty good idea of what the construction cost will be. Of course, it's a few billions plus or minus. But the operating cost of the terminal was an absolute unknown. So again, what we care is an airport that is very functional, that's efficient both in cost and in processes, and that allows us, as you were saying, to expand when time comes without having to completely start from scratch.
So we met up in Mexico City a few months back.
True.
What has happened in that, because that was pretty fresh, that the election had just happened, the project was killed, but where is that project headed now? There was lots of different ideas and points of view at that IATA conference in Mexico City, but has it moved on? Is there any clarity on
I was in Mexico a few weeks back, and where there was, let's say, there was a trade fair that took place in what is supposed to be the next airport for Mexico City, Santa Lucia. The week after, the President AMLO came down to put the inaugural stone, but they realized and accept that they still have to answer many questions. So it's a very complex process.
So it's going to be a multi-airport solution.
It will be a multi-airport solution. Again, they have the reasoning. We don't necessarily agree with it, but again, let's move the page and move on. And the discussions we're having is how can we start identifying what needs to be done for the system to work. So there's one component, which is the airspace, which is the most critical one for now. Until the point where we resolve this, we the airlines believe that you cannot truly understand what you'll be doing with the ground infrastructure. But then there's a whole discussion about connectivity. A few carriers said I'm willing, other carriers said I'm not willing to move. And I think at this stage, one thing is probably already quite clear to the Mexican government is it doesn't make sense for airlines to be at multiple locations. The cost of doing that is far too high.
It never does.
The inefficiency is far too high. But they also are starting to realize that the challenge around connectivity.
They might want to ask Montreal how that worked out for them.
Well, we know what happened there. They tore everything down, but that's, I guess, the next step in Mexico. So we just recently wrote a letter to the Secretary of Transportation, asking him to establish a few working groups where we can then, at a very high level, start looking into the airspace and strategy for each of the airports, and there's also a need to keep up the current airport. So the airport, Mexico is a city that has significant challenges. The airport keeps sinking, and that's the nature of the construction. It's accepted, was designed to be that way. But it will need to be eventually, given the decision, expanded.
They had all that flooding problem last year. I remember the aircraft operating area looked like a lake. Well, I guess it was a lake originally. So it
was a lake originally, yes. But and that's one of the points. I mean, they said, look, if we are to keep the site, we need to discuss what are we going to do with the runways. They probably need to go through significant repavement works. But then it's the need to refurbish the existing terminals. There's discussion now on building a Terminal 3, a Terminal 4. But again, we're at the very initial stages of the discussion. So what we hope now is that the government, let's say, accepts that the best way to do it is to do it together, as we were discussing earlier on. Pull us in and make sure that from the very beginning they can leverage on the expertise. I mean, it's not the first airport to be built. It's not the first airport that has challenges like these in terms of congestion and then having to deal with the pains of growth. But that's what we need to do, to work together.
And as we said earlier, the flexibility in the design is key, whether it's Mexico City or anywhere else. And again, I've been through some projects where you're halfway through the construction and the fleet strategy of the home-based airline changes. And so you can say, well, the airline should stick to their strategy. Well, if the market changes, the airline's going to change their strategy. They might be getting into a 787 fleet, or they might be changing from a narrow body to a wide body strategy.
True.
If your design's not flexible. And so, and that needs to be a conversation in both directions. But have you seen some examples in your business where people have done a good job of planning for the adaptability and the change in business model or the change in carriers?
We're in the middle of a process now. São Paulo is also expanding their capacity. So they are. I mean, Brazil suffered a lot because of the crisis, the financial crisis. We're now at a stage where numbers are starting again to bounce back, and they anticipate that they will probably hit the ceiling in years to come. So they are starting a capex program now. We've been supporting them, and part of what we've been discussing on the different scenarios that they're studying is exactly that, how we can build in flexibility. It normally comes at a cost, but it's a cost that's necessary. In many cases, it's a must. You can go wrong. And there are a few ideas that are coming out of that. So one of the challenges in Brazil, and again, it's given the local regulation, is when you have a change of nature of flights. So if you have a domestic flight that arrives and will depart an international flight, the way the regulation works in Brazil, it would practically require you today to tow the aircraft around the terminal. And that's time-consuming, expensive. And as a consequence of that, airlines have to take certain measures, like instead of going into a contact position, going to a headstand to facilitate the process.
And I guess that's the point behind poorly designed or constrained airports. It's expensive to build a new one, and somebody needs to pay for that.
Yes.
But it's also expensive to have an inefficient airport that your turnaround times are 75 minutes because you have to tow airplanes around, or you simply can't bring aircraft in because you're out of capacity. So it goes back to the opening salvo that we talked. If airlines and airports work together on some of these really problematic airports, maybe we can get to the point where...
And in the case of Guarulhos, that's what we're trying to do. So we are designing, helping design and validate scenarios for them to let's say, come to the conclusion which is the more appropriate one. But then jointly, what we have to do, and we are going back to the government and saying there are a few business practices that are defined by the government that need to change. So this is, again, it's a joint approach where we accept that our ability to do good will depend on someone else's, in this case the government, being willing to also adapt and evolve and modify their regulatory framework.
Well, you need willing partners, and you need honest brokers in the middle, and you need all those things.
That's what we try to do.
Okay. Well, I think on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was great.
My pleasure.